Welcome to another video tutorial. This is actually going to be the start of a series of videos on the topic of scripting for RPG in a Box. So originally I was going to try and fit this into one video, but as there's quite a lot to cover, I've decided to redo this as a series of videos covering each specific topic. So in this video, we're going to take a look at variables and properties. Now, I've already covered this particular topic before in a video, so I will link to that video in the description of this one as well. The reason I'm doing this again is because I want to just kind of explain what variables are for those that are complete beginners to scripting and want to get a good grasp of the concept of variables and why they should use them, what they're for, that sort of thing. But the other video is useful for understanding the difference between the types, but I will cover that as well briefly in this video too. So let's get on to this topic. So first of all, what are variables? So variables are basically storage containers, if you will, that hold data that, clue being in the name variable, will change over time. So it's data that will vary depending on what you put inside it. And think about variables as giving data names so that your code, your scripts, can easily find and refer to that data, either to make reference to it or to change it. So kind of like when you give your pet a name, and you call your pet by that name, it should respond. So if you had a dog, for example, called Max, and you called out for Max, the dog should come to you. So variables are kind of the same thing. Your code makes a call to a particular piece of data by its name, and that data comes back. So to give you an example of what a variable would look like in RPG in a Box, if we go to, let's create a new script for this called script1. And for most of this, I'm going to use the box side code window just because I'm familiar with, it's just what I'm used to. I'm used to typing the code now. But I will leave this screen open so you can see what the nodes look like. And of course, I will briefly mention how they're laid out as we see them. Okay. But just to quickly give you an example of a variable in RPG in a Box, if I was to type $max equals dog, that would be, or maybe we could do it the other way around. Let's say we have $dog equals max. So in this case, we have a variable called dog, and the content of that variable is text called max. So when this particular script calls out for dog, max comes back. Okay, so it's a way of retrieving that particular piece of data. Now, the reason why I called it $max is because using the analogy of giving your data a name, and like your pet has a name, you call out for the pet and it should respond. This is the same thing. So $max would be the equivalent of the code calling out to the dog and the dog response. So this is what's called a local variable. Now, there are three types of variable, if you will, inside RPG in a Box. There's local variables, which is what $max is, and then there are properties. And there are two types of properties inside RPG in a Box. You have entity property and you have global property. Let me explain the difference between the three types, starting with local variable. So local variable, the clue is in the name local. Local variables, basically, there is an exception to this rule, but it's just easier to think about it as this being the rule. Local variables reside and exist in the script within which they are written. So here, for example, I have a script called script1. Let me just apply and save this. We have a script called script1, and whenever you create variables, so here's an example of me creating or assigning a variable, the node in question that you would, if you were to do it visually, is this node here. So whenever you wanted to assign a value to either a variable or a property, you would drag this in and you would set your variable and the name of it and what it should be set to here. And if we click the wizard icon, you can see all the possible data types that we could set this variable to. And we'll go through these late in the next video. So that's the node in particular for assigning variables. Okay, and that's what the code looks like. So here's another example of a variable. $my_variable would be the name that the code would call out to. And in this case, the number 1 is going to come back when it does so. Okay. So local variables, as I say, they exist within their own script. So here I have a script called script1. And if I save this, then this script has a variable called $max, and it currently equals the text dog. If I was to close this script and create another script called script2, and I was to, let's say, do an if check, and we'll get into what if checks are and all of that further into this series, but just to explain local variables, if I was to do if $max is equal to dog, then in theory that should be true because we've set $max to equal dog in script1. The problem is it's a local variable only to script1. So in script2, $max actually doesn't even exist. So there is no $max, let alone being the value of dog. So in other words, this script, when it calls out for $max, it's not going to respond. The dog is missing, max is missing, it's not in this script. But more importantly to understand is the local variables don't just exist within their own script, they actually get cleared out at the end of a script's lifespan. So what is a script's lifespan? Let's just quickly cover that. When a script gets executed, so let's say we had a whole host of functions, this script does a whole host of things, let's just drag some things in. Let's just leave it at that for now. So we have a script here that sets a variable, $max equals dog, and then it does a couple of other things like adding a character to the game and adds an effect to the game, etc. if we had this all set up properly. So what happens is this script gets executed in a top-down fashion. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the full screen and click Edit so you can see the line numbers. Okay, so scripts get executed from 1 to, in this case, 1 to 3, or however many line numbers a script has. But in other words, it gets executed from top to bottom. So it's going to do line 1, then line 2, then line 3. And then because there's nothing on line 4, doesn't exist, may as well delete that. Because there's no line 4, the script then stops. And when it stops, that's basically it. That's the end of that particular script's lifespan. Once a script ends, any local variables that were initially created get deleted. They get cleared out, flushed out. Yeah? Local variables are temporary. They don't remain in the memory of your game. So if we needed to refer to max outside of this script and after this script is executed, then there is an exception to the rule, which I will talk about later on in the series. But for now, it's easier just to understand, because otherwise it's contradictory information, which is never good for understanding something. For now, it's just better to get your head around the fact that local variables, when a script gets finished, local variables cease to exist. So if we want to refer to max outside of this script, we need to use a property rather than a local variable. Local variables are typically used for temporary retrieval of data and manipulating that data. You'll see local variables being used throughout this series as we discuss the other topics. So hopefully you'll be able to see where I'm using local variables. I'll try and, if I can remember, I'll try and talk about them as I'm using them, just to explain why I'm doing it this way. But for now, just understand that this is a local variable. This is one of the types of variable you can have in RPG in a Box. It's temporary and will be deleted at the end of the script's execution. So this isn't going to be useful for example, storing the state of something. So have we killed a particular enemy? This isn't going to be useful because the moment this script stops executing, we're going to lose that information. So the next script is going to think we haven't completed the quest or that the enemy isn't dead. So we need a more permanent way of storing data in that particular instance. So this is where properties come in. And properties are divided into two types. Let's cancel this script. Let's get rid of... Let's just leave it as the local variable for now and bring that back. Let's go to our map. And let's bring in, let's say, Justin. And if we select Justin in the map editor and we click Entity Properties, if we scroll down, there's a section in the properties for the entity, Custom Properties. And if we expand this down, we can see the Properties panel. And we can pick a type. And again, I will go over these in the next video, which will be covering data types. But for now, let's say we add a string and we add property. And this would be the equivalent of Max dog. It's the same thing. This is the name, this is the value. But the difference, however, is an entity property remains in existence attached to this entity. So as long as this entity is alive, i.e. it's on the map, it hasn't been killed, it hasn't been removed, and as long as the player is in the same map as this entity, then this property and its value are accessible. And just to show what it looks like in the script editor, what an entity property looks like, to declare it in text, it would be entity, open and close square brackets. You would then have the entity ID, and we'll cover that in the third video in this series. But for now, I'm just going to put ID in. So we'll come back to what ID is. But then you would put dot property, and then open and close square brackets. And then this is where you would put the name of the property. So in this case, Max, and then it equals, and then the value. So this is the text version of this panel here. So you can either create your properties this way, or you can create them in your script. This would create it. We don't need to do this particular bit of code because we're already creating it here. This is going to create a property on this entity called Max with a value of dog. But you could also do it a different way, would be to do encode by typing entity and then the ID dot property Max equals dog. And the advantage to entity properties, just to reiterate, is that as long as the entity is in existence and as long as the player can see that entity, i.e. it's in the same map as that entity, then the name and the value the property and the value are accessible via any scripts in that moment. If the player was to go to a secondary map where this entity does not exist, and therefore the property doesn't exist, then any scripts that call out for this particular entity and its property are not going to be found. Okay? So you typically wouldn't put important game state information like, have you completed a quest, or is a particular enemy dead? I mean, it would make sense to check if this particular NPC is dead as a property, but the problem is if you have any NPCs that are in a secondary map that need to know if this particular NPC is dead, they're not going to know that because they're not going to have access to this NPC's information because they're in a secondary map. So for any information that needs to be known all the time, that's where global properties come in. And global properties are found in game configuration, ignore that, and they're under global properties, okay? And I've got a couple set up here, but I'll just delete that one for now. And I'll quickly add a global property called Max with the value dog. And this would be the exact same way. It looks exactly the same as the entity property interface, but this time it's global properties. And if you want to know how to do a global property in script, it's done by typing global dot property, open and close square brackets, the name of the property, in this case max, equals, and then the value dog. Okay. If we apply and save that, you should see 3 assigned values. So this is the local variable $max equals dog. This is the entity ID property max equals dog. And this is global.property max equals dog. So you can see how you would set entity, globals, and locals with this assigned value node. Okay. The advantage to global properties is they're global. The whole game, all the time, will be able to reference this variable or property and its accompanying data. So every single script, no matter what map you're on, no matter what state of the game you're on, every script within your game, if you call out for global property max, it will come back all the time with the data that's inside that property. So these are invaluable for anything that you need to store about your game. So have you completed a quest? Is a particular NPC dead, regardless of which map you're on? Have you spoken to a particular NPC? Have you, how much health the player has? It doesn't have to be, states of things. It could also be an important number that you want to hold on to so that you can reuse later. So for example, the player's health, so that if it goes down, you can put it back to a specific number. Anything that you need to know or store all the time would be a global property. Okay. This does not get deleted ever. This is always available. Entity properties don't get deleted. They can be overridden. So for example, if I was to change this to cat, then now all of a sudden it's not dog anymore. But max will always exist. Okay. As long as the entity exists. If I was to go to a different map, then I can't refer to this anymore, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The moment I go back into the same map as this entity, the property and its value will be accessible again. Does that make sense? Now, I have already gone over this, as I say, in a video on this topic before, and I've delved into it a bit more in depth with examples, like actual gameplay examples. So I will refer you to that video in the description to check out as further study if you've still got some questions about local variables and properties. But for now, that'll wrap up this video. I hope it's been a good introduction to variables. They are a very important part of scripting, so get familiar with them because nearly all scripts at some point will reference either a property or a local variable because they are like the cornerstone of scripting. Anyway, so with that said, that'll wrap up this video. Thanks for watching.